There is a war most people never see, yet nearly everyone feels its aftershocks. It does not announce itself with noise or spectacle, but with pressure, subtle, persistent, and strangely coordinated. You sense resistance where there should be momentum, confusion where clarity once lived, fatigue that sleep cannot cure. These are not random inconveniences of life. They are signals, and signals demand interpretation. History teaches us that every significant shift, personal or global, is preceded by preparation in the unseen realm. Nothing erupts without incubation. Nothing collapses without corrosion. As we approach 2026, we are not merely crossing into another calendar year. We are entering a convergence point, and convergence points attract attention, both divine and adversarial. The question is not whether opposition exists. The question is whether you recognize its methods. Darkness never confronts strength head-on. It studies it, surrounds it, and seeks entry through neglect, ignorance, or distraction. Its greatest advantage has always been secrecy, and its greatest fear has always been exposure. Tonight is not about fear. It is about literacy, spiritual literacy, because once patterns are recognized, power shifts. And once light enters a system, darkness loses its leverage. What follows are not speculations, but signs, 4 of them, that reveal preparation before attack. The unseen war is never chaotic, never impulsive, and never without design. What appears to the untrained observer as random hardship, sudden resistance, or inexplicable disruption is in fact the visible residue of an invisible structure at work. Darkness does not improvise. It plans, it maps, it observes, and it waits. Disorder is not its method, deception is. The greatest mistake people make is assuming that spiritual opposition behaves emotionally or erratically. It does not. It behaves intelligently, strategically, and patiently. In every arena of conflict, preparation precedes engagement. No general enters battle without reconnaissance. No system collapses without prior compromise. In the same way, spiritual opposition operates through long-range observation rather than immediate confrontation. It studies rhythms, habits, reactions, and vulnerabilities. It notes what exhausts you, what distracts you, what discourages you, and what dulls your discernment. By the time an attack becomes visible, it has often already succeeded in shaping the environment. This is why so many people are shocked by the timing of their struggles. They say, "It came out of nowhere," but it did not. It came from somewhere hidden. The unseen war operates on the principle of delayed recognition. If you do not recognize the structure, you will misinterpret the outcome. You will blame circumstances, people, chance, or even yourself, never realizing that you are responding to a system that was activated long before the event itself. Patterns are the language of intelligence. When disruptions repeat with precision, when obstacles emerge at key moments, when confusion coincides with decision points, structure is present. Chaos does not repeat cleanly. Randomness does not synchronize. Only intelligence does that. Darkness is not creative, it is imitative. It mimics order in order to subvert it. This is why the opposition often feels overwhelming, not because it is stronger, but because it is coordinated. The unseen war also operates through timing rather than force. It waits for transitions, thresholds, and seasons of change. It understands that movement creates exposure, growth creates vulnerability, advancement creates attention. The enemy rarely attacks stagnation because stagnation is already a victory. Instead, it targets momentum. It seeks to interrupt trajectories, derail callings, and exhaust perseverance. Its aim is not always destruction, but delay. Delay erodes faith more effectively than direct assault. Another mark of structure is escalation. The unseen war rarely begins at full intensity. It tests, probes, and measures response. Small compromises are suggested first. Minor distractions are introduced. Subtle distortions are normalized. If these are accepted, pressure increases. If they are resisted, tactics shift. This adaptive behavior reveals intelligence. A random force would not adjust. A strategic one does. Ignorance is not neutral in a structured war. It is an invitation. When people deny the existence of organized opposition, they forfeit discernment. When they dismiss spiritual realities as coincidence, they surrender awareness. And awareness is the first line of defense. Not vigilance born of fear, but perception rooted in truth. The unseen war thrives where assumptions replace examination. Structure also explains why breakthroughs are often preceded by resistance. The closer one moves toward alignment, the more visible the opposition becomes. This is not punishment, it is confirmation. Resistance intensifies when progress threatens established systems. Darkness does not attack what is ineffective. It targets what carries influence, purpose, or future impact. Understanding that the war is structured changes how one responds. You stop reacting emotionally and start responding intelligently. You no longer panic at pressure because pressure reveals direction. You no longer internalize opposition as personal failure because you recognize it as external resistance. You begin to ask better questions, notice patterns, and adjust posture. The unseen war depends on surprise. Structure loses power when exposed. Once you recognize that opposition is organized, you stop underestimating it, but you also stop fearing it, because structure implies limits. It implies rules. It implies that darkness is operating within boundaries it did not create, and that awareness alone shifts the balance of power. Nothing in the spiritual realm is random. What you are facing has a logic, a source, and an intention. When you discern the structure, you reclaim agency. You move from being a target to being a participant in understanding. And understanding has always been one of the most underestimated weapons of light. What manifests suddenly is almost never sudden. In both natural systems and spiritual realities, visibility is the final phase, not the first. By the time something becomes observable, measurable, or undeniable, it has already passed through stages of formation that were concealed from casual perception. Darkness understands this principle well. It rarely announces its intentions because announcement invites resistance. Instead, it prepares quietly, patiently, and incrementally, knowing that most people only respond to what they can see. Preparation is the most underestimated phase of conflict. It is where outcomes are decided long before engagement begins. In the unseen realm, preparation often looks like atmosphere rather than action. A subtle heaviness enters daily routines. Motivation wanes without obvious cause. Discernment dulls slightly, not enough to alarm, but enough to delay response. These are not attacks, they are environmental adjustments. The terrain is being shaped so that when manifestation occurs, it feels inevitable rather than engineered. Dark preparations often target perception before circumstance. If reality can be reframed, resistance can be neutralized. Confusion is introduced not to overwhelm, but to exhaust. Repetition without resolution drains clarity. Questions arise without answers. Delays multiply. None of this feels hostile on its own, but together they soften the will. By the time the visible disruption arrives, the internal posture has already been compromised. Another method of preparation is normalization. What once felt intrusive slowly becomes familiar. What once raised concern gradually loses urgency. Small compromises are justified as necessary, temporary, or harmless. This is not coincidence, it is calibration. When tolerance increases, sensitivity decreases. Darkness rarely pushes boundaries abruptly. It nudges them until they no longer feel like boundaries at all. Timing plays a critical role in preparation. Opposition studies seasons of vulnerability, transitions, growth phases, moments of decision. These are windows where focus is divided and attention is stretched. Preparation intensifies during these times because distraction is easier than confrontation. When energy is consumed by change, subtle interference goes unnoticed. By the time stability returns, the groundwork has already been laid. Preparation also involves isolation, though not always physical. Emotional and spiritual isolation are more effective because they are harder to detect. A person may still be surrounded by others, yet feel increasingly unheard, misunderstood, or disconnected. This sense of internal distance weakens reinforcement. Without external confirmation, internal doubts grow louder. Darkness prefers targets who question themselves more than the environment around them. One of the clearest signs of preparation is inversion. Truth begins to feel heavy, while falsehood feels relieving. Discipline feels restrictive, while compromise feels freeing. This reversal does not happen overnight. It is conditioned. Over time, resistance is associated with discomfort, and surrender is associated with relief. When manifestation finally occurs, the individual is more likely to comply than confront, not because they are weak, but because they have been conditioned. Visible manifestations often take the form of sudden loss, conflict, or disruption. People ask why everything collapsed at once, unaware that collapse requires prior erosion. Foundations are weakened quietly. Supports are removed subtly. By the time the structure fails, the damage appears instantaneous, but it is merely the final stage of a long process. Understanding preparation restores perspective. It removes the shock factor. When you realize that what you see is the end of a sequence, not the beginning, you stop being overwhelmed by appearance. You begin to trace patterns backward. You identify early indicators. You recognize that intervention is most effective before visibility, not after. This awareness also removes self-condemnation. Many people blame themselves for not reacting sooner, not realizing that the entire strategy depended on concealment. Darkness thrives on delayed recognition, but delayed does not mean defeated. Exposure interrupts momentum. Once preparation is uncovered, it loses much of its power. Light has always had one decisive advantage: revelation. Preparation cannot survive sustained illumination. What is hidden depends on remaining hidden. The moment patterns are named, tactics must change, and change introduces error. The unseen war is not won by panic at manifestation, but by discernment during preparation. When you understand that dark preparations precede visible manifestations, you no longer wait for collapse to respond. You respond to atmosphere. You adjust at the level of thought, alignment, and vigilance, and in doing so, you disrupt outcomes before they ever arrive. Information is never neutral. It is either clarifying or corrupting, aligning or disorienting. In every conflict, whoever controls the flow of information shapes the outcome long before force is ever applied. This is as true in the unseen realm as it is in any intelligence operation. Darkness understands that it does not need to overpower you if it can misinform you. It does not need to destroy you if it can misdirect you. And so the battlefield shifts from circumstances to perception, from events to interpretation. One of the earliest indicators of spiritual interference is distortion in the way information is received and processed. Messages become fragmented. Signals lose coherence. What once made sense now feels ambiguous. You hear many voices but gain little clarity. This is not accidental. Confusion is not merely a byproduct of complexity. It is often a tool deployed intentionally. When information overload replaces insight, discernment is weakened without resistance ever being triggered. Dreams, impressions, symbols, and even recurring thoughts become points of access in this kind of warfare. Not every dream is significant, but patterns are rarely meaningless. Repetition is a form of communication. When certain images recur, when particular themes surface repeatedly without resolution, something is attempting to occupy mental real estate. The goal is not always deception, sometimes it is distraction. If attention can be captured, energy can be redirected. Words also function as carriers. Narratives shape reality more powerfully than facts alone. Darkness introduces stories that feel plausible, reasonable, even compassionate, yet subtly erode truth. These narratives often appeal to emotion rather than reason, urgency rather than wisdom. They bypass scrutiny by presenting themselves as personal insight rather than external suggestion. Once internalized, they no longer feel foreign, and that is precisely the danger. Another tactic is fragmentation of truth. Rather than denying truth outright, pieces are isolated and removed from context. A partial truth can be more misleading than a complete falsehood because it lowers defenses. When context is stripped away, conclusions shift, meaning changes. What was once stabilizing becomes destabilizing. This is especially effective against those who value knowledge but neglect coherence. The battlefield of information also includes silence. Absence can communicate as effectively as presence. When guidance seems withheld, when clarity delays without explanation, anxiety fills the gap. The mind seeks resolution, and in that search, it becomes vulnerable to suggestion. Darkness often does not need to speak loudly. It simply waits for uncertainty to create noise internally. Timing matters here as well. Informational attacks often coincide with decision points. Just enough doubt is introduced to delay action. Just enough ambiguity is injected to justify hesitation. Momentum stalls, opportunities pass, and afterward the individual wonders why they did not move when they had the chance. The answer is rarely fear alone. It is often informational interference. Another subtle method is desensitization. Exposure to constant streams of alarming, trivial, or conflicting information dulls discernment. When everything feels urgent, nothing feels important. When every voice claims authority, authority itself is questioned. This environment benefits darkness because it erodes trust in reliable signals. The result is paralysis masked as caution. It is important to understand that information warfare targets identity as much as knowledge. Questions like, who am I? and what am I called to do become clouded. Self-concept destabilizes. Once identity is uncertain, direction becomes negotiable. This is why narratives that undermine purpose are so persistent. If you doubt your role, you will hesitate to act within it. Protection in this battlefield does not come from isolation, but from filtration. Not all input deserves access. Discernment is not about rejecting information, but about ordering it. Truth has structure. It aligns rather than scatters. It produces coherence rather than fragmentation. When information consistently produces confusion, exhaustion, or fear without resolution, its source should be questioned. Light responds to information warfare with clarity, not volume. The solution is not more voices, but truer ones. Not faster answers, but deeper understanding. Stillness becomes strategic because it allows signal to separate from noise. Reflection restores context. Patience undermines urgency-driven manipulation. Once you recognize that information itself is a battlefield, you stop treating confusion as a personal failure. You begin to see it as a condition that can be addressed. You become intentional about what you allow to shape your thinking, and when information is ordered correctly, power returns to the one who discerns. Darkness loses leverage when its narratives are exposed. Symbols lose power when interpreted correctly. Silence loses intimidation when understood as a tactic rather than abandonment. The battlefield does not disappear, but the advantage shifts, because in any war, the side that understands the terrain controls the outcome. Before anything changes around you, something is always challenged within you. External disruption is rarely the opening move. It is the end game. Long before circumstances shift, authority is questioned, identity is weakened, and confidence in one's position is subtly eroded. Darkness understands hierarchy. It understands order. And it understands that authority, once compromised internally, does not need to be attacked externally. It will collapse on its own. Spiritual authority is not about volume, aggression, or visibility. It is about alignment. When a person knows who they are, where they stand, and under what authority they operate, resistance loses its leverage. That is why the earliest phase of opposition almost always targets self-perception rather than surroundings. You begin to second-guess decisions that were once clear. Convictions that once felt solid start to feel negotiable. You do not abandon them outright, you simply hold them more loosely. This erosion is subtle by design. If authority were challenged openly, it would provoke defense. Instead, it is questioned quietly. Thoughts arise that sound reasonable, even humble. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I overestimated my role. Maybe this isn't as important as I thought. These thoughts do not feel hostile, which is why they are effective. They present themselves as wisdom, caution, or maturity, when in reality, they are diminishment. Another sign of authority being targeted is disproportionate discouragement. Resistance does not match the situation. A minor setback produces excessive heaviness. A small delay feels like definitive failure. This emotional imbalance is not accidental. When authority weakens, resilience follows. Without inner authority, perseverance becomes effort rather than posture. You push instead of stand, and pushing is exhausting. Darkness also targets authority through comparison. Attention shifts outward. You become more aware of others' progress than your own alignment. Measuring replaces obedience. Imitation replaces authenticity. Authority erodes when identity is outsourced. Once you begin defining yourself by external standards rather than internal calling, direction becomes fragmented. You are no longer moving forward, you are reacting. Silencing is another method. This does not always mean literal silence, but self-censorship. You hesitate to speak what you once expressed freely. You delay actions you once took decisively. You wait for confirmation you never needed before. This hesitation is often justified as prudence, but over time it becomes paralysis. Authority that waits for permission is no longer authority. Internal accusation frequently accompanies this phase, not conviction, which leads to correction, but accusation, which leads to shame. The focus shifts from growth to guilt. Energy that should be directed outward is turned inward in constant self-examination without resolution. This inward spiral weakens authority because authority requires outward orientation. It is meant to be exercised, not endlessly audited. One of the most revealing signs is the loss of peace without the loss of faith. You still believe, but you no longer rest. Trust becomes intellectual rather than experiential. You know the right answers, but they no longer anchor you. This disconnect creates vulnerability because authority flows from trust, not information alone. When trust erodes, control attempts increase, and control is a poor substitute for authority. Darkness prefers to neutralize rather than destroy. A person who still believes but no longer acts is less threatening than one who openly resists. Passivity is a victory that looks like humility. Delay is a triumph disguised as patience. This is why authority is targeted early. Once action stops, circumstances will eventually align to justify inaction, and the individual will believe the outcome was inevitable. Restoration of authority does not begin with changing circumstances. It begins with recognition. When you see that hesitation was engineered, that discouragement was disproportionate, that self-doubt was introduced rather than discovered, clarity returns. Authority is remembered before it is exercised. Identity is reclaimed before it is expressed. True authority does not announce itself, it operates. And when it is restored internally, external resistance loses its foothold. Circumstances may still challenge, but they no longer define. Pressure may still exist, but it no longer controls direction. The attack fails not because it was dramatic, but because it was premature. When authority stands, opposition recalculates. Darkness does not waste resources on immovable positions. It withdraws, redirects, or delays. That alone reveals the truth. Authority was always the target, and once it is secured, everything else realigns accordingly. Time is not merely a measurement, it is a structure. Seasons are not poetic abstractions, they are frameworks within which events gain meaning. Nothing significant unfolds in isolation from timing, and nothing adversarial operates without regard for cycles. Darkness understands this far better than most people are willing to acknowledge. It does not merely react to moments, it positions itself within seasons. It studies transitions, alignments, and convergences, because those are points of maximum influence. A season is not defined by dates on a calendar, but by shifts in alignment. When one phase closes and another opens, stability is temporarily reduced. Old patterns no longer function, and new ones are not yet established. These thresholds create opportunity, but they also create exposure. Darkness does not create seasons, it exploits them. It watches for moments when identity is in motion, when direction is being reassessed, when momentum is real but not yet consolidated. Cycles amplify this effect. Repetition reveals vulnerability. When similar challenges reappear at predictable intervals, it is not coincidence, it is reconnaissance. Patterns expose habits. Habits expose weaknesses. Darkness observes what resurfaces when pressure increases and what disappears when ease returns. Over time, it learns when to apply pressure for maximum disruption with minimal effort. Convergences are especially significant. These are moments when multiple transitions overlap. Personal growth intersecting with relational change, professional movement coinciding with spiritual awakening, external instability aligning with internal decision. Convergences feel intense because they are. They compress choice, consequence, and opportunity into a narrow window. Darkness pays close attention to these moments because a small interference can have long-term effects. One reason attacks feel disproportionate during certain seasons is because the season itself carries weight. Resistance is not merely about stopping progress, it is about corrupting trajectory. A minor redirection early in a cycle produces major deviation later. Darkness prefers early interference because it requires less force and attracts less attention. By the time the deviation becomes obvious, the season has passed, and correction feels costly. Another important factor is prophetic timing, whether recognized or not. Certain seasons carry heightened potential for alignment, clarity, and advancement. These seasons are not announced publicly, but they are sensed internally. A stirring begins. Restlessness increases. Old limitations feel intolerable. New possibilities feel close but undefined. Darkness recognizes these signals as indicators of impending movement and prepares accordingly. Preparation during these times often looks like distraction rather than confrontation. Energy is scattered, focus is diluted, urgency is misplaced. The goal is not to stop movement entirely, but to ensure it begins misaligned. A journey started in confusion requires constant correction. Darkness benefits from delayed clarity because delay compounds over time. Cycles also explain why resistance sometimes intensifies just as things begin to make sense. Clarity threatens established interference. When alignment increases, opposition becomes more visible. This is not failure. It is confirmation that a threshold has been reached. Darkness resists exits more aggressively than entries because exits represent loss of influence. Misinterpreting seasons is one of the most common errors people make. They assume resistance means they are in the wrong place, when it may indicate they are in the right season. Conversely, ease is often mistaken for confirmation, when it may simply indicate inactivity. Discernment requires distinguishing between pressure that refines and pressure that diverts. Understanding cycles restores patience without passivity. You stop forcing outcomes that belong to future seasons, and you stop delaying actions that belong to the present one. Timing becomes an ally rather than an adversary. Darkness loses leverage when you are no longer surprised by seasonal resistance. Another critical insight is that seasons end whether interference succeeds or not. Darkness is working within time, constraints it does not control. It must act within windows. When a season passes without derailment, momentum accelerates. What was resisted becomes established. What was threatened becomes fortified. This is why awareness of timing is not optional. It is strategic. You cannot choose your seasons, but you can choose how you move within them. You can recognize convergence without panic. You can respond to cycles without resignation. You can stand firm at thresholds instead of retreating from them. When you understand that attacks align with seasons, cycles, and convergences, you stop personalizing resistance. You stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "Why now?" That single shift reframes everything, because why now leads to preparation, while why me leads to paralysis. Darkness depends on ignorance of timing. Light thrives on discernment of it. And when seasons are understood, opposition is no longer mysterious. It is anticipated, contextualized, and ultimately outlasted. Discernment has been misunderstood as something rare, mystical, or reserved for a select few, when in reality it is a functional necessity for anyone navigating unseen conflict. It is not a luxury, it is a survival skill. In environments where forces operate invisibly, the ability to perceive patterns, motives, and sources is more important than raw strength or enthusiasm. Darkness relies heavily on the myth that discernment is optional or inaccessible, because an undiscerning individual is far easier to influence than a powerful one. At its core, discernment is the ability to distinguish origin and trajectory. It asks not only what is happening, but where it is coming from and where it is leading. Many people react to events without ever interrogating their direction. They manage symptoms while missing systems. Discernment cuts through surface activity and exposes underlying intent. Without it, even well-meaning actions can reinforce adversarial outcomes. One of the greatest obstacles to discernment is emotional noise. Fear, urgency, excitement, and discouragement all distort perception. Darkness often amplifies emotion, not to overwhelm, but to cloud clarity. When emotional volume increases, analytical capacity decreases. Decisions made under pressure are rarely examined afterward, which makes them ideal points of manipulation. Discernment requires emotional regulation because it depends on stillness as much as insight. Another misconception is that discernment is passive, something that simply happens if one waits long enough. In reality, it is cultivated through attention, pattern recognition, and intentional reflection. It grows sharper with use and duller with neglect. People who assume they lack discernment often have simply not exercised it. Like any faculty, it strengthens through application. Darkness attempts to disarm discernment by normalizing distraction. Constant input fragments attention. When focus is divided, patterns disappear. Discernment requires continuity of observation, the ability to notice what repeats and what escalates. Fragmented awareness prevents this. The result is a reactive posture where each incident is treated as isolated rather than connected. Discernment also demands humility, which may seem paradoxical. It requires acknowledging that not every thought originates internally, not every impulse is trustworthy, and not every opportunity is beneficial. Pride resists discernment because it assumes self-sufficiency. Humility invites discernment because it remains open to correction. Darkness prefers confidence without examination because it leads to blind spots. A critical function of discernment is distinguishing between pressure that refines and pressure that diverts. Not all resistance is adversarial. Some tension strengthens alignment. Discernment evaluates outcome rather than intensity. Does this pressure produce clarity or confusion? Does it deepen resolve or erode it? Does it lead toward coherence or fragmentation? These questions reveal source more reliably than emotion. Discernment also protects against overreaction. Without it, people may attribute every difficulty to opposition and respond with fear or aggression. This misfires energy and reinforces instability. True discernment produces proportional response. It identifies what requires attention and what can be ignored. Darkness benefits when individuals exhaust themselves fighting imagined threats while ignoring real ones. Another sign of discernment at work is patience without passivity. Discernment does not rush to conclusions, but it does not delay action unnecessarily either. It recognizes when waiting clarifies and when waiting enables interference. Timing, once again, is crucial. Discernment senses when a window is opening or closing, even when evidence is incomplete. Importantly, discernment is reinforced by alignment. The clearer one's values, commitments, and direction, the easier it becomes to detect what does not belong. Confusion often arises not from lack of information, but from misalignment. When priorities are scattered, discernment struggles to find reference points. Alignment creates contrast, and contrast sharpens perception. Darkness often attempts to discredit discernment by labeling it as judgment, paranoia, or rigidity. This social pressure discourages its use. People fear being seen as extreme or uncharitable. As a result, they suppress valid perceptions. Discernment does not accuse, it evaluates. It does not condemn, it clarifies. When properly understood, it produces wisdom rather than suspicion. The empowering truth is that discernment is accessible. It is not granted selectively, it is developed intentionally. It grows through consistency, honesty, and reflection. Each time you pause to examine rather than react, discernment strengthens. Each time you question trajectory rather than appearance, it becomes clearer. In a structured, unseen war, discernment shifts the balance of power. It removes surprise, it exposes preparation, it reveals timing. Darkness loses its greatest advantage when it is understood. Discernment does not eliminate conflict, but it ensures you are never fighting blind. Ultimately, discernment is not about seeing everything, it is about seeing enough. Enough to choose wisely, enough to stand firmly, enough to move forward without fear. And in a world where much operates unseen, that is not merely helpful, it is decisive. Light has never been merely reactive. It does not exist to contain darkness, negotiate with it, or slowly retreat from it. Light advances by its nature. Wherever it is present, it displaces what opposes it, not through forceful struggle, but through exposure. Darkness depends on concealment to survive. Light requires no permission to operate, it simply reveals. This is why the greatest threat to darkness has never been strength, numbers, or even zeal, but clarity. Many people subconsciously adopt a defensive posture in spiritual matters, assuming survival is the goal. They brace for impact, prepare to endure, and hope to minimize loss. This mindset, while understandable, misunderstands the nature of light. Light does not huddle, it illuminates. When you adopt a defensive posture, you concede ground that was never meant to be surrendered. Darkness gains influence not because it is stronger, but because it is allowed space. Dominance does not mean aggression. It means authority expressed through presence. Light dominates by defining reality, not by reacting to distortion. When truth is established, falsehood loses its frame of reference. It has nothing to anchor to. This is why clarity is so destabilizing to darkness. Confusion creates room for manipulation. Clarity removes it. One of the clearest expressions of light's dominance is peace under pressure. Peace is not the absence of conflict, it is stability within it. When an individual remains anchored despite external turbulence, it exposes the limits of opposition. Darkness thrives on escalation. When escalation fails to produce fear, it loses momentum. Calm clarity is disarming because it refuses to play by adversarial rules. Another dimension of light's dominance is initiative. Darkness reacts to light, not the other way around. It studies, prepares, and interferes, but always in response to movement, alignment, and purpose. When light advances intentionally, through alignment, obedience, and clarity, darkness is forced into reactive mode. Reaction is inherently weaker than initiation. This is why revelation is such a powerful force. Revelation does not merely inform, it reorders. Once something is seen, it cannot be unseen. Once a pattern is recognized, it cannot be ignored. Darkness must then either retreat or escalate, both of which expose it further. Revelation accelerates resolution. It shortens conflict by removing ambiguity. Many underestimate the power of consistency. Light expressed consistently becomes overwhelming not through intensity but through inevitability. Darkness can withstand sporadic bursts of resistance, but it cannot endure sustained clarity. Over time, consistency erodes interference. What once required effort becomes natural. What once resisted begins to dissolve. Dominance also involves occupying territory rather than defending boundaries. This is an internal reality before it becomes an external one. When your mind, values, and direction are occupied by truth, there is no vacant space for distortion to enter. Darkness exploits gaps, not strongholds. Light fills space simply by being present. Another often overlooked aspect is joy. Joy is not frivolous, it is a signal of alignment. It communicates security, confidence, and perspective. Darkness struggles against joy because joy undermines its narrative of inevitability and despair. When joy persists in adversity, it exposes opposition as temporary and limited. Light's dominance is also revealed in outcome rather than confrontation. You do not need to argue with darkness to defeat it. You outgrow it. You move beyond its influence. You align with truth so completely that former tactics no longer apply. Darkness loses relevance before it loses presence. Importantly, dominance does not mean invulnerability. Pressure may still come. Resistance may still appear. But the relationship to it changes. Opposition becomes informational rather than intimidating. It reveals where growth is occurring and where alignment is increasing. Resistance becomes feedback rather than threat. When light is understood as dominant, fear loses its authority. Fear thrives on uncertainty and perceived imbalance. Clarity restores equilibrium. You realize that opposition is finite, conditional, and reactive. It does not define the future. It responds to it. This understanding reframes preparation. You do not prepare to survive attacks. You prepare to advance despite them. You do not brace for loss. You anticipate progress. You do not fixate on darkness. You focus on alignment. And alignment produces momentum. Ultimately, light does not win by overpowering darkness. It wins by rendering it unnecessary. When truth defines reality, deception has no function. When clarity governs direction, confusion cannot compete. When authority is exercised calmly and consistently, opposition fades into irrelevance. Light has always been dominant. Darkness has always known this. That is why it prepares, interferes, and conceals. And that is why understanding this truth changes everything.